Hello everybody, today on cars that I've known about for ages but thought I'd never get the chance to drive, it's this. No, it's not your grandma's Corolla hatch, instead it's the mighty Toyota Blademaster G. Right about now, I expect that my audience is divided into two camps, those who know exactly what it is that I'm driving and those who don't have a clue. So, in order to bring the latter up to speed, allow me to explain to you what exactly it is that I'm driving today. If this car looks a little bit familiar to you, there's a good chance that's because it is. You may remember that in the mid-2000s, Toyota made the slightly odd decision to rebrand the Corolla hatchback as the Auris. Exactly why, I don't know, but I expect it might have something to do with the fact that the Corolla is regarded by many as an old man's car, and so by giving it a new name, they might have been trying to appeal to a slightly newer audience. In any case, it didn't really work. All that happened was a load of people went, "A Toyota what? Don't know what that is." And a decade and a half later, they have now returned to the Corolla nameplate for the vast majority of markets. This, at heart, is essentially a member of that first generation Auris family, which was in production from 2006 until 2012. But to me, the best way to fully understand this car is by saying its name. I always thought it was the Toyota Blademaster G, one thing that represents this model specifically. However, that's not the case at all. Instead, you need to break it down, because what this actually is not the Toyota Blademaster G. It's in fact the Toyota Blademaster G. What's the difference, you ask? Well, the Blade is a model in of itself, and that I didn't even realise until I did my research for this car. Essentially, it's a slightly more upscale version of the Auris, which they did also sell in Japan, but evidently they felt like there was enough of an opportunity there to sell a couple of different ones from different Toyota dealers. It is the master bit though that I think is of greatest interest, because it's that which signifies this is not a car powered by your average shopping trolley 1.6, 1.8 or 2 litre 4-cylinder. Instead, up front this car is packing a 3.5 litre Toyota V6, the 2GR FE, as seen in a whole bunch of Toyota products, including the likes of the Camry, the Corolla, but also to me, things like the Lotus Evora. It makes 280 horsepower and I think about 250 odd pound-foot of torque. That's about 340 newton meters. It is mated exclusively to a 6-speed automatic gearbox, which has a pair of paddles on the wheel, so if the mood takes you, you can also control it manually, and naturally, in a little while, I'll be doing plenty of that. The final piece of the puzzle then is the G, and that signifies the trim. I don't think there were really all that many for the Blademaster, but the G brings you a few nice things like this sort of very dark, almost blue-looking Alcantara and a few other bits too, which honestly I would love to be able to tell you about, but I just can't, because while doing my research for this car, I couldn't find all that much about it. I had to Google some pictures of the old Auris, which we got here in Britain, to check what was different, and honestly, other than the materials and the fact some of it's in Japanese, it all does look fairly familiar. Curiously, despite the fact it was never sold here, in period, a number of UK magazines did actually review one. I expect Toyota GB imported it because they thought it would be a laugh. And the general consensus seemed to be that it's a very unusual take on the hot hatch formula, because while the engine was unusually generous in terms of both performance and capacity for a hatch of the day, the rest of it was rather humdrum. I mean, just look at it. It does look like an ordinary Toyota Auris. If one drove past you, I think you'd really struggle to recognise it for what it is. In fact, this car's owner, Brad, who's now brought me I think about 11 different vehicles, bought the badges for the back at the princely sum of some 70 quid, just so people wouldn't hopefully mistake it for your grandma's Corolla. Inside then, nice bits of Alcantara inside, it is just a standard 5-door Auris. And that's not an inherently bad thing. It all feels fairly high quality and there's quite a few nice design touches. I love these door handles that extend all the way to the lever that actually releases them. The buttons are very much 2000s Japanese car, as are the floor mats, which I am a little bit in love with. You may have noticed the aftermarket pedals in these cars, which are actually an Italian brand, Isotta, I think. They're a bit odd. I don't think I'm actually a fan of them. Considering it's an automatic, heel and toe of course is not a consideration, and I don't even really like the way they look. They also make it just a little bit too easy to accidentally press the wrong pedal, and particularly in a pokey automatic, that would be a concern. The brakes themselves though are very nice, very light pedal but with plenty of travel, and you can modulate them fairly easily. There is very little in the way of leather in here. I think there's a bit on the steering wheel and that's about it. The handbrake is rather funky and is reminding me of the Honda CR-V that I drove the other day. I don't know what was going on in the 2000s with Japanese handbrakes, but evidently somebody was having a lot of fun. I also appreciate these little sort of, I suppose you call them quarter lights over here, which give you extra visibility and mean that it's actually a fairly easy car to place. It does feel quite big from in here, more MPV than hatchback, and the driving position is quite high. This is in spite of the fact that I have got the seat as low as it will go. It's also not a particularly sporty or sculpted affair, and it does feel very much like they have just taken an Auris and chucked a great big engine in it, then gone home and called it a day, which really then would leave you with two questions. First off, why did Toyota even bother? And secondly, why would anyone go to the trouble of dragging one all the way from Japan here when we've already got plenty of other interesting performance hatches to choose from? Well, I'm going to try and get past this C-Reg Land Rover, which is chucking out all sorts of nasty stuff from its exhaust, put my foot down and find out. Well, I'll be honest, I am struggling a little bit. Why would Toyota build this? Well, I expect they did it because they could. However, why should you buy one? That's tricky. Of course, there is the eternal, it's different and a little bit interesting. But if I park that for a moment, because I have to, it is a frustrating car. The engine is fantastic, has a nice good spread of power and pulls quite happily to its 6,600 I think RPM red line. Particularly in that last sort of 2,000 RPM, it has a real vigour about it and it's a rather decent thing. No, not the world's most exciting power plant, Busso it is not, however, it does the job very well and is far more interesting and exciting to me than a 2-litre turbocharged 4. Unfortunately, it doesn't really sound all that exciting. In fact, when you look at the car, you'll notice you can't really even see the exhaust. So I apologise if my camera hasn't really recorded any noise beyond the sound of air rushing over the microphone. The gearbox then, I've put it in its sport mode, and though you can control it manually, most frustratingly, when you put your foot down, it'll still change gear regardless. That is so frustrating, and it takes away a huge piece of interaction that you want from anything that is driver focused. The paddles are okay, and the box itself is not particularly keen to respond, but also not slow enough that it annoys you. It's, I would say, par for the course for a sort of mid-2000s auto box. It does the job well enough. Yes, I would have loved a nice 6-speed manual in here, but Toyota themselves never ever sold this engine so equipped. In fact, when Lotus did, they had to take the gearbox from the diesel version of the Auris and mate it to this engine. They had to build themselves a special adapter plate to make that happen. The steering then, it's light, a little bit on the vague side. The turn-in is actually okay, but you can feel that the suspension is still set up in a fairly soft way. It's quite compliant actually, very plush. The ride quality is actually really good. In fact, for a Japanese performance car, I'd go so far as to say it's excellent. Because the roads of Japan are so notoriously good, many performance cars do come over from there with suspension setups that are just too stiff. They simply don't work here in Britain. This though, feels like it's actually been built for it. It's lovely. There's even a fair amount of pitch and roll in the car, allowing you to judge exactly how much you're asking from the chassis. Although I am certain the car does not have a limited slip differential and conditions today are hardly ideal. It's a little cold, damp and misty. Traction has still been okay. put your foot down, and it does a fairly decent job. This may also be in part due to the fact the car has had a brand new set of fork and tyres fitted, because the ones it had when it landed were way past their sell-by date. Where the car really shines though is when you give up trying to have fun with it and you just relax. And then you realise it feels like a much more grown-up car than just about any other hot hatch. That combination of torque converter automatic with nice, big, naturally aspirated multi-cylinder engine is wondrous. Pulling out at junctions is near EV effortless. The gearbox, smooth, refined, the engine, quiet, torquey, even at low RPM, it's a delight. I also happen to know this engine is capable of doing fairly decent MPG too, and I see no reason why on a run it couldn't give you over 32 the gallon. In fact, for those eco-minded, you'll even notice that when you are driving gently, a little green light will pop up on the dash to tell you that you're driving as economically as you possibly can. Go away! Naturally, this engine comes with a little bit of a weight penalty, so it's the heaviest of all Auris variants at about 1500 kilos. But still, compared with some other hot hatches of today, that's actually not all that bad. In any case, it just isn't the sort of car where you want to be measuring every single aspect of it, because that simply isn't what it's any good at. But in truth, this was never ever going to be a top trumps card. Engine aside, the rest of it is just a good, solid, decent hatch. And if anything, this car is actually a bit of a sort of baby GT, and I know my conclusion there is the same as all the other outlets that reviewed it back in the day. I had to break with my own tradition of reading other reviews ahead of this one because there was so little information out there. Even so, I didn't really glean all that much from them. How much then are you to pay for one of these? Well, that's also tricky to find out because there simply aren't any for sale beyond this one, which is currently listed at £9,000. And on account of the fact it's the only one out there, I couldn't tell you if that's good value or not. It sounds about right to me. For comparison, a nice Mark V Golf R32 is going to set you back a little bit more, and while that's going to be a better performance car, this, I think, is the better day-to-day proposition. An Alfa Romeo 147 GTA then is going to be a far more exciting and dramatic thing to live with. Certainly sounds a lot better, but it's also massively flawed. But those now seem to command about £12,000 to £16,000, making this really a relative bargain. And the simple fact is, I think this is going to be considerably more reliable than an old Alfa 147. Given the fact that many parts in it will just be standard issue Auris 2, I wouldn't even be all that concerned about getting spares for it. It should be a fairly easy thing to own. But if I were to have one of these, I think it'd be a car I'd have to modify. It's just crying out for it. The whole thing looks, feels and sounds so plain. Considering how exciting the concept is, I can't help but think it's another car where Toyota just expected you to tinker with it. And tonight, I'm going to hop on the internet and find out if there are, or were, any conversion kits, aftermarket exhausts, wheels, things like that for this, because there must be. And one of these tarted up, I think then would be a really interesting, different and exciting JDM car that you could own, drive and use, which is also still at heart a totally practical Toyota. And then it'd make sense. As it is now, it's still interesting and I'm sure would appeal to certain people, but not to me. In any case, I am delighted to have finally been able to get my hands on the Toyota Blade Master G. I want to say a big thank you to Brad for bringing it out, and as ever, to you for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below, and subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you for the next one. Bye-bye.